There are moments that silence the world, not because they are loud, but because they are true. On a day like any other, on a stage built for laughter, an unexpected voice crossed oceans, pierced the veil of celebrity, and reminded us all that the soul hears more than the ear ever could. Steve Harvey had just begun sharing one of his usual reflections, something warm, funny, maybe even wise, when a quiet murmur backstage broke the flow. A message, official, from Africa. The audience shifted slightly, unsure if it was a bit or a real interruption. Steve paused, clearing his throat, scanning the crowd. "I've just been told there's a special message from Burkina Faso." No one clapped, no one laughed. The name itself held a kind of mystery, and then behind him the screen glowed. A seal, a flag, and then a face. Not a celebrity, not a politician hungry for spotlight, but a man with a gaze as still as the earth and a voice as old as the dust that raised him. "Mr. Steve Harvey," the man began, "I speak to you not as a leader, but as a brother." The studio froze. Steve sat, stunned. He wasn't prepared for what followed. No one was. The man on the screen was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, and he wasn't speaking for politics. He was speaking for something deeper, something buried beneath years, continents, and silence. "You do not know me," Ibrahim said, his voice steady, "but we know you. In the red earth of our villages, in the echo of cracked radios, your voice carried farther than you imagined." Steve blinked rapidly. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't staged. It was as if someone had reached into his life from a world he didn't know he had touched. "In our darkest days," the president continued, "when fear sat at every door and hope was just a breath we forgot to take, your laughter came through the static. And it reminded us, purpose is not a luxury, it's a necessity." Steve's hands gripped the chair. Tears welled in his eyes, uninvited but undeniable. "We called it the heart of the sun," Ibrahim said softly, "a light that warms without burning. That's what we saw in you." There were no camera cuts, no dramatic music, just the quiet realization that sometimes a man can live his whole life not knowing he's been carrying others all along. And just as the screen faded, a final sentence came, spoken in the president's native tongue. No subtitles, just truth carried by tone. Steve turned to the translator, his voice cracking. "What did he say?" The translator, eyes glassy, answered, "Even the strongest man needs to know his voice still matters." That was the moment everything changed. The studio sat in stillness long after the message ended. Steve Harvey's usual stage, meant for jokes, lighthearted confessions, and daily wisdom, had transformed. Not because of lighting or music, but because the atmosphere itself had shifted. The air had weight now, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that grounds. That night, Steve didn't go home the same man, and by morning he had packed a bag, said nothing to his team, posted nothing online. This wasn't for followers. This was personal. A silent passport, a one-way flight, and a heart full of questions he wasn't sure how to ask. When the plane landed on the sun-baked runway of Ouagadougou, there was no red carpet, just the heat of West Africa wrapping around him like a mother's embrace. A young aide held a cardboard sign. "Welcome, Brother Steve." No fanfare, no press, only purpose. As the convoy moved slowly through the dusty streets, Steve stared out the window, taking in homes built with more love than luxury, smiles brighter than the sun, in a language he couldn't understand but already felt. Children waved as they passed, some barefoot, some holding hands. One little boy pointed and yelled, "Steve!" He had no idea how that child knew his name, but perhaps knowing wasn't the point. Feeling was. Their first stop wasn't a palace. It wasn't a presidential hall. It was a clay-colored building behind wide gates, an orphanage. The van doors opened, and Steve stepped into a courtyard filled with over 100 children. Their eyes held something America had long forgotten: unfiltered sincerity. Many held hand-painted signs. "You matter." "We love you, Mr. Steve. Thank you for speaking hope." Steve's throat tightened, his hands trembled. And then, from among the crowd, a small voice rose. "Steve, A little girl no older than 10 stepped forward. Her braids danced with the breeze, and in her hands was a trembling notebook. "My name is Asha," she said, barely above a whisper. "This is for you." Steve knelt, eyes locked with hers. Gently, he took the notebook and opened it. The first page read, "Dear Mr. Steve, my papa died, my mama is sick. Sometimes I cry at night. But one day I heard your voice. You said you were born to do something great. I believed you. Thank you for making us feel seen. Your little sister, Asha." He didn't try to hold back the tears this time. His arms opened instinctively, and Asha walked into them without hesitation. There, beneath a mango tree, in the heart of a place he'd never been, a man from Cleveland and a girl from Burkina Faso embraced like old family. Nearby, a soft drum began to play, a lullaby, gentle, ancient. A translator leaned in and whispered. This song was hummed by President Traoré's grandmother while she cooked. Steve froze. "My grandmother used to hum something just like that," he whispered. In that moment, the past wasn't separate. It wasn't American or African. It was universal. The memory of a grandmother's hum had crossed oceans and timelines, and now it stood singing in the arms of legacy. Steve stood up slowly, the notebook pressed to his chest. He turned to the children and spoke softly. "In all my years, I've received awards, applause, fame. But this," he lifted the notebook slightly, "this is the greatest honor of my life." Then he looked directly at the camera that had quietly followed him. "If this moment touched you," he said, voice thick with emotion, "leave a comment below. Tell us what it made you feel. And if your heart stands with these children, just write one word. Amen." "Thank you for speaking hope." Steve's throat tightened, his hands trembled, and then, from among the crowd, a small voice rose. "Steve!" A little girl no older than 10 stepped forward. Her braids danced with the breeze, and in her hands was a trembling notebook. "My name is Asha," she said, barely above a whisper. "This is for you." Steve knelt, eyes locked with hers. Gently, he took the notebook and opened it. The first page read, "Dear Mr. Steve, my papa died, my mama is sick. Sometimes I cry at night. But one day I heard your voice. You said you were born to do something great. I believed you. Thank you for making us feel seen. Your little sister, Asha." He didn't try to hold back the tears this time. His arms opened instinctively, and Asha walked into them without hesitation. There, beneath a mango tree, in the heart of a place he'd never been, a man from Cleveland and a girl from Burkina Faso embraced like old family. Nearby, a soft drum began to play, a lullaby, gentle, ancient. A translator leaned in and whispered. This song was hummed by President Traoré's grandmother while she cooked. Steve froze. "My grandmother used to hum something just like that," he whispered. In that moment, the past wasn't separate. It wasn't American or African. It was universal. The memory of a grandmother's hum had crossed oceans and timelines, and now it stood singing in the arms of legacy. Steve stood up slowly, the notebook pressed to his chest. He turned to the children and spoke softly. "In all my years, I've received awards, applause, fame. But this," he lifted the notebook slightly, "this is the greatest honor of my life." Then he looked directly at the camera that had quietly followed him. "If this moment touched you," he said, voice thick with emotion, "leave a comment below. Tell us what it made you feel. And if your heart stands with these children, just write one word. Amen." They didn't go to the palace next. That was the second surprise. The convoy veered off the paved road, winding through narrow, dusty lanes until it stopped beside an old marketplace. Weathered stalls stood in rows like forgotten memories. The smell of charcoal, spices, and history thickened the air. President Traoré stepped out first, dressed not in formality, but in memory. A simple white shirt, linen trousers, and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to be announced. He turned to Steve and pointed at a collapsed wooden frame. "This," he said quietly, "was my grandmother's stall." Steve didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes scanned the remnants. Broken wood, scattered stones, a space held together by memory. I used to sit right here, Ibrahim continued, counting coins, listening to your laughter on a radio with bad signal. Your words weren't always clear, but your spirit always was. He knelt and picked up a small, smooth stone, pressing it into Steve's palm. This is where hope began for me. Steve stared at the stone like it had been waiting for him his entire life. And maybe it had. Sometimes we don't choose where healing finds us. Sometimes it finds us in the broken corners we didn't even know belonged to us. Under a shaded awning nearby, a group of women stood watching. One among them, frail, slow, regal in her silence, stepped forward. "This is Awa," said the president, "the last of my grandmother's circle, the only one still alive who used to sit with her in this market." Awa's eyes were clouded with age, but when she looked at Steve, something cleared. She reached out, touching his face gently. The translator leaned in as she spoke. "She says," he whispered, struggling through tears, "they never understood your language, but they understood your joy." Steve's breath caught. "She says her sister, the president's grandmother, would have fed you if she met you. She would have called you her son." Steve dropped to his knees, not because of sorrow, not because of cameras, but because something inside him had been named, something even he hadn't realized was missing. Awa whispered again, this time more softly. The translator trembled. "She says a man with a voice that gives others strength is never truly alone." Tears fell freely now, tracing Steve's cheeks without shame. Ibrahim knelt beside him. The two men sat together, not as host and head of state, but as sons raised by women who never met, yet somehow sang the same songs into their hearts. The market faded, the air grew still, and in that sacred silence, nothing mattered but memory. Later that evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the sky in deep orange and crimson, the convoy rolled onward, leaving the echoes of the marketplace behind. They didn't speak much during the drive. Words felt unnecessary, even inadequate. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, sacred, humming with all that had just passed. The final stop for the day was a small village school. It wasn't grand, not by any architectural standard, but there was something honest about it. Its cracked walls, faded paint, and a single tree in the courtyard that seemed to hold generations of secrets in its bark. Underneath that tree stood a small group of children, drums in hand, eyes wide with anticipation. As Steve stepped out of the vehicle, they began to play a rhythm. Simple, slow, haunting. The translator leaned close. "This song," he said, "was hummed by the president's grandmother while she cooked. Now the children sing it for her memory." Steve froze. The melody, it was the same one his own grandmother had hummed when he was a boy, crying in the backseat of a car parked in some forgotten lot in Cleveland. The ache in his chest returned, but this time, it didn't hurt. It healed. Ibrahim stepped beside him. "Our grandmothers," he said gently, "gave us the same comfort, thousands of miles apart." Steve nodded, eyes shining. He sat down on a wooden bench, surrounded by children who carried no judgment, no expectations, only light. One little girl stepped forward and handed him a small wooden carving. Two hands, open, holding a heart. "They made this for you," the translator said. "It means your voice gave them shelter." Steve clutched it tightly. He didn't speak. His soul did. In that quiet moment, the fame, the suits, the applause, all of it fell away. What remained was truth. Pure, humble, unshakable. Two boys, now men. One from Ohio, one from Ouagadougou. Both raised on struggle. Both comforted by grandmothers who never knew each other, but hummed the same notes into their bones. This wasn't coincidence. This was legacy speaking. That night, Steve didn't return to a hotel. He stayed in a guest home near the school, with no Wi-Fi, no television, just the stars above and the hum of insects below. He couldn't sleep, not from discomfort, but from overwhelming clarity. He sat on a simple cot, notebook in hand, trying to write something, anything, that might capture what he felt. But the words didn't come. Not yet. Some truths demand silence first. The next morning, he walked outside before sunrise. The air was cool, still. He wandered toward the tree in the schoolyard and sat beneath it. Children were still sleeping, but the echo of their laughter from the day before lingered in the wind. And as the sun began to rise, slowly, softly, Steve whispered to no one in particular, "This is what purpose feels like." Hours later, they prepared to return to the city. As the convoy moved, Steve noticed a wall on the roadside. Painted in bold strokes were words in French, most of which he couldn't understand. But one word stood out: respect. He stared at it, a single word, so simple, yet it carried everything. When they arrived at the presidential residence, there were no guards in ceremonial dress, no long speeches, just President Traoré waiting on the steps, holding the same notebook Steve had brought from Asha. "She wanted me to have this," he said, "but I think it belongs to both of us now." Steve smiled. It belongs to everyone who forgot their voice still mattered. They sat beneath a wide tree in the garden, two men in silence once again. Ibrahim spoke first. "Do you know what the children call you now?" Steve shook his head. "Uncle Steve." Steve chuckled through a tear. "I'll take that title any day." The president's tone grew more serious. This message, this moment, wasn't about you or me. It was about all of us, about remembering the power of voice, of presence, of choosing to see one another. Steve nodded slowly. "I just told jokes, man." "No," Ibrahim said firmly. "You gave us laughter when we had none. That's a kind of medicine most forget exists." Steve looked out over the courtyard. If people only knew what a smile meant here, they'd stop chasing so much. Ibrahim placed a hand on his shoulder, then helped them remember. "Take it. Show it." Steve took a deep breath. "I will." There were no flashing cameras when Steve landed back in the United States. No red carpets, no interviews. He had requested it that way. This journey wasn't meant to be broadcast. It was meant to be lived. For once, a story so powerful had no need for headlines. It required silence to be understood. And so, the next morning, Steve walked into his studio with the same familiar crew waiting. But something in him had shifted. The usual pre-show laughter, the playful teasing, the jokes about wardrobe, none of it landed quite the same. He wasn't distant. He was just deeper now. And as the show began, there was no opening monologue, no warm-up music, just Steve, alone on stage. He carried something in his hands, not a script, not cue cards, but a carved piece of wood, two hands, holding a heart, the children's gift. He placed it gently on the desk and looked into the camera, not with a comedian's charm, but with the gaze of a man who had stood on sacred ground. "In my life," he began, voice steady, "I've received many awards, many gifts, but none like this." He paused, fingers brushing the carved edges. "I met a man, a president, not just of a nation, but of something greater, the human heart." The audience didn't clap, not yet. They could feel this wasn't for applause. "He reminded me of something I had forgotten," Steve continued. "That love, memory, and honor, those are bigger than fame, bigger than success." His voice caught slightly, but he didn't back away from it. "He called me a son of Africa," Steve said, "and I call him my brother." Then, in a gesture that startled even the production crew, Steve nodded toward the control booth. A video began to play. Not a flashy montage, not a highlight reel, just a recording. The sound of children, singing, in a language few would recognize, but every heart would understand. No subtitles, no narration, just raw, unfiltered emotion. The studio grew still. Viewers at home paused, unsure what they were hearing, but unwilling to turn away. It wasn't just a song, it was a memory, a lullaby that had crossed oceans. As the final notes faded, Steve leaned forward once more. No script in his hand, just a letter. Asha's letter. "Y'all," he said almost in a whisper, "sometimes we forget how far our voice can travel. We think our pain is ours alone, but it's not. Someone else out there is waiting for the sound of hope, waiting for someone to tell them they matter." He held up the letter. "This little girl, she reminded me that we don't have to be famous to be remembered. We just have to speak love, speak truth, and speak it often." His eyes searched the camera lens as if looking into every home. "If you've ever felt forgotten," he said slowly, "if you've ever wondered if your words still matter, Let me tell you right now, they do. A hush fell over the room. He wasn't performing. He was testifying. And if you're listening to this, he added, if something in your chest stirred while you heard that song, then do me one favor. Leave a comment. Say what it made you feel. And if you stand with the children of Burkina Faso, if your heart believes in light, in legacy, in the power of memory, just write one word. He held up the carving again. Amen. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a single clap echoed. Then another. Not wild applause, but reverent agreement, like people saying yes with their hands. The comment section, unseen by Steve but alive nonetheless, began to swell. I wept. I didn't expect this. I felt healed. I remembered my grandmother's song, and beneath many of those lines, one simple word began to appear, again and again, Amen. Later that week, the carving still sat on Steve's desk, untouched by dust, untouched by time. It wasn't decoration, it was declaration. Every time he glanced at it, he didn't just see a gift, he saw a responsibility to keep speaking, to keep reaching, to never let purpose be replaced by popularity. That evening, he met privately with his team. No more just entertainment, he said. We tell stories now, real ones that matter. The shift wasn't loud, it was quiet, like sunrise, but its warmth reached everyone. And somewhere across the ocean, in a country most still couldn't pronounce, the children kept singing. They didn't know what kind of ripple they had created. They only knew Uncle Steve came, listened, and left changed. That was enough. But for Steve, it wasn't finished. He returned home with more than memories. He returned with a mission. He contacted schools, orphanages, aid groups, quietly, without media, without spotlight. How can I help, he asked. What do they need? His name wasn't always recognized in those circles, but his sincerity was. Donations were made, books were sent, notebooks, solar lamps, radios. One teacher in a rural village later wrote, "Your support reached us like rain in dry season." Steve read the message and wept. And in a rare moment on his show, he pulled out that letter and read it aloud. "This is why we talk," he said. "This is why stories matter." The audience leaned in. They could feel it, the change, the awakening. "You know," Steve continued, "I used to think I had to build something big, be someone great, but maybe, just maybe, greatness is in listening, in holding a child's pain and not turning away." His voice cracked slightly. "Asha, if you're watching, your notebook sits next to me every day, and it reminds me, real power isn't in being seen, it's in seeing others." He placed the letter down, took a long breath, and said, "Let that be the legacy." Behind the scenes, the show's producers began preparing a short documentary segment about Steve's trip, but he stopped them. "This isn't for TV, it's for hearts. Let the people feel it, not through edits, through silence." And so, one Friday night, they aired nothing but 30 minutes of footage, raw, unpolished, of the children singing, of the market, of the carved gift. And in that silence, viewers didn't scroll. They stayed, and thousands of comments poured in. This healed something in me. I haven't cried like this in years. I remembered who I used to be. My mother used to hum that same tune. Steve watched it alone from his home office. No audience, no applause, just him and the stillness of knowing something had shifted far beyond his control. He whispered quietly, "This is what happens when we speak from soul." Somewhere in the background, the carved heart caught the light, two hands holding the intangible. And Steve, eyes closed, resting his head on his arm, whispered one last thing before drifting to sleep. "I'm not done." Weeks passed, but the echo didn't fade. In a world addicted to noise, something soft had found its way in and stayed. What had started as a letter, a whisper from across the sea, had become a quiet fire in the hearts of thousands. And then, one evening, Steve received a package. No name, no label, just twine wrapped around brown paper. Inside, a photo, dozens of children, all holding notebooks. On the back, one sentence read, "We write now because you reminded us our voices matter." That night, Steve couldn't sleep. He walked outside and stood under the stars, the photo pressed to his chest, and for the first time in a long time, he prayed not for success, not for strength, but for softness. The next morning, something stirred in him. Not an idea, a calling. He called his team again. "I want to go back," he said. "Soon." They didn't question it. They saw it in his eyes. This wasn't a publicity tour. This was a return. Weeks later, under the same sun that once greeted him with mango-scented wind, Steve stepped once more onto Burkina Faso soil. This time, no convoy, just a pickup truck. No translator, just trust. The driver took him to the edge of a rural village where the air was thick with wood smoke and wildflowers. And waiting there, barefoot in the dust, was Asha, older now, taller. But her eyes still held that same uncertain softness. She smiled. "You came back." Steve knelt again. "Of course I did." They didn't need words. She handed him a second notebook. "This one," she said, "has all our stories. Mine, my friends, my brothers, even the new kids." Steve opened it slowly. The pages were full. Drawings, words, fragments of loss and hope stitched together with the handwriting of children who had once forgotten how to believe. One page read, "I used to think my story didn't matter. Now I know it does." Another said, "Uncle Steve made us feel big." A boy's sketch showed a cracked radio with hearts coming out of it. Steve's hands trembled. He turned to Asha, tears already rising. "I didn't do this," he said. "You did." She shook her head gently. "No, you heard us. That's what matters." That evening, under a sky smeared with gold and violet, Steve sat with the children again. But this time, he didn't speak. He listened. To each story, each laugh, each memory whispered with the quiet pride of children, no longer invisible. Ibrahim arrived just before sunset, not in a motorcade, on foot, dressed like the villagers. No ceremony, just presence. He greeted Steve with a quiet nod and sat beside him, listening with the same reverence. At one point, a small boy tugged at Ibrahim's sleeve. "Are you the king?" he asked. Ibrahim smiled. "No, I'm your brother." The boy seemed satisfied with them. Nearby, a girl asked Steve, "Are you still famous?" He chuckled. "Only if you say so." That night, around a fire that cracked and whispered like an elder telling old stories, Ibrahim stood and addressed the children. "You don't need microphones to be heard," he said. "Your voice begins the moment you believe it matters." Steve added, "And it echoes when someone listens." The children nodded solemnly. These weren't just kids anymore. They were authors, witnesses, truth-tellers. Weeks turned into months, but the stories of those children never left Steve's heart. Each morning he woke with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his journey was far from over. One evening, under the sprawling African sky, Steve sat beside Ibrahim and Asha, listening to the village elders recount ancient tales of resilience and hope. The air was thick with wisdom, but also with the quiet power of change. Ibrahim turned to Steve and said, "This is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about every forgotten voice, every unheard story. We are all connected by the need to be seen." Steve nodded, feeling the weight and the lightness of those words. As the fire flickered, he realized that the greatest stages are not the ones built with lights and applause, but the humble spaces where truth meets courage. Before leaving, Steve held Asha's hand and whispered, "Your stories will live forever because you dared to share them." And in that moment, the world felt smaller, kinder, more human. The legacy of a single voice back in the United States, Steve brought that chorus with him. His shows changed, his words deepened, and his mission expanded beyond entertainment. Letters poured in, from listeners inspired, from strangers awakened, from souls remembering their own power. Steve often reflected on that first message from Burkina Faso, the quiet call that shattered the noise. It was a reminder that sometimes the world, with all I. If you've listened this far, know this. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Your presence is a light in the darkness. Speak your truth, hold your heart, and never forget, even in silence, you are heard.